Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Blackwood estate stood like a monument to decay against the October sky, its Gothic spires piercing the gray clouds that had gathered since my arrival. As a real estate photographer, I documented hundreds of properties, but none had made my camera feel quite so heavy in my hands. The auction house had been clear. Capture every room, every angle, every detail that might entice potential buyers. What they hadn't mentioned was the way shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, or how the silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. I pushed through the massive oak doors, their hinges protesting with a low groan that echoed through the empty foyer. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through tall windows, creating an ethereal haze that made the grand staircase appear to dissolve at its edges. The air tasted of old wood and something else, something metallic and stale that coated my tongue unpleasantly. My first shots were routine. Wide angles of the main hall, detail work on the carved banister, the ornate chandelier hanging like a crystalline spider from the vaulted ceiling. Through my viewfinder, everything appeared normal, predictable even. It wasn't until I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen that I noticed it. A blur of gray, vaguely human in shape, standing just behind and to the left of where I'd been positioned. The figure was indistinct, as if caught mid-movement or shrouded in fog, but unmistakably present in every frame I'd taken. I felt my pulse quicken as I scrolled through the images. Each photograph contained the same anomaly, always behind me, always just outside my peripheral vision, always that same nebulous form wrapped in what looked like vapor or smoke. My rational mind suggested camera malfunction, lens condensation, or tricks of the light. But the consistency of the appearance unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Moving to the library, I tried different settings, cleaned my lens meticulously, even switched to a backup camera. The room was a photographer's dream. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, and filtered sunlight creating dramatic shadows across Persian rugs. Yet as I worked, I felt increasingly watched, as if unseen eyes tracked my every movement. The sensation intensified when I discovered that the new photos showed the same gray presence, now appearing closer, more defined. In one image, I could almost make out facial features, the suggestion of hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and what might have been a thin smile. My hands began to tremble slightly as I continued through the house. Each room yielded beautiful shots marred by that persistent, impossible figure. In the dining room, it stood beside the mahogany table. In the conservatory, it lingered among the dead plants. In the master bedroom, it seemed to lean over the antique four-poster bed with what appeared to be curiosity or longing. It was in the study that I found the journals. Hidden behind a false panel I'd discovered while photographing the built-in bookshelves, 3 leather-bound volumes sat wrapped in oiled cloth. Dr. Ephraim Blackwood's name was embossed in gold on each cover, along with dates spanning from 1887 to 1889. Against my better judgment, I opened the first volume. The handwriting was precise, scientific, but the content made my skin crawl. Dr. Blackwood had been conducting what he called spectral photography, attempting to capture and bind human souls using chemical processes and arcane rituals. His notes described experiments with silver plates treated with strange compounds, exposure times calculated according to lunar phases, and subjects who had volunteered for his research. The boundary between the visible and invisible realms, he wrote, is far thinner than modern science acknowledges. With the proper techniques, one can not only observe the spiritual essence but trap it, preserve it, study it indefinitely. As afternoon gave way to evening, I found myself compulsively reading. Blackwood's final entries grew increasingly frantic. His last successful subject, a man named Thomas Ashford, had apparently become problematically adherent to the photographic process. The spirit wouldn't release from the plates, wouldn't move on to whatever realm awaited it. Instead, it had begun manifesting around anyone who entered the laboratory with photographic equipment. It seeks to complete the binding, Blackwood wrote in his final legible entry. Thomas has learned to transfer his attachment from plate to plate, camera to camera. He hungers for the moment of capture, the click of the shutter that promises him continued existence in our world. I fear I have created something that cannot be undone. The final pages were nearly illegible, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scrawls about failed exorcisms and abandoned experiments. The last entry was a single line. It follows the lens now. God help whoever next aims a camera in this house. Darkness had fallen while I read, and the mansion around me seemed to pulse with new meaning. Every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind through broken seals, felt charged with possibility and threat. I gathered my equipment, suddenly desperate to leave, but found myself drawn back to my camera's memory. The most recent photos showed the figure with startling clarity. No longer a gray blur, Thomas Ashford, for I was now certain that's who it was, appeared as a gaunt man in period clothing, his eyes fixed directly on the camera lens with an expression of desperate hunger. In the final image, taken just before I'd found the journals, he appeared to be reaching toward the camera, his fingers nearly touching the frame's edge. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and flee, but something kept me rooted in place. Perhaps it was professional obligation, or maybe simple curiosity, but I found myself raising the camera again, aiming it at the empty air where I felt his presence most strongly. The viewfinder showed nothing unusual, just the study's bookcases and shadows. But when I pressed the shutter, the flash illuminated something that made my breath catch. For just an instant, I saw him clearly, not through the camera, but with my own eyes. Thomas Ashford stood 3 feet away, his mouth open in what might have been speech or a silent scream, his hands stretched toward me in supplication or threat. The flash faded, plunging the room back into darkness, but I could still feel him there, closer now. The temperature around me seemed to drop several degrees, and my breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. I lowered the camera with shaking hands and checked the image. There he was, clearer than ever, but something had changed. The hunger in his expression had been replaced by something else. Recognition, perhaps, or satisfaction. And behind him, barely visible in the photograph's background, stood another figure, then another, and another. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing. Dr. Blackwood's other subjects, all trapped in the same liminal space, all drawn to the camera's promise of existence. They stood in a crowd behind Thomas, their faces bearing the same desperate hope, the same terrible need. I fumbled for the journals again, searching for some indication of how to break the binding, how to release them from whatever photographic purgatory they inhabited. But as I read by the camera's LCD glow, I began to understand the horrible truth. There was no release. Blackwood had tried everything, destroying the original plates, burning his equipment, even attempting to photograph empty rooms to dilute their presence. Nothing worked. The spirits had learned to transfer themselves, to exist in the space between reality and image, feeding off the moment of capture, growing stronger with each photograph taken in their presence. And I had been feeding them all day. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every click of my shutter had been an invitation, every flash a doorway. I had been strengthening their connection to this world, making them more real, more permanent. The photos weren't just capturing their presence, they were creating it. I heard movement in the hallway outside the study, the soft shuffle of feet that shouldn't exist. When I looked up from the journal, I saw them reflected in the study's dark windows, not just Thomas, but all of them, standing in a loose circle around my position. Their faces were clearer now, more solid, as if my photographs had been slowly developing them back into existence. The camera in my hands felt suddenly hot, its metal body warming against my palms despite the room's growing chill. The LCD screen flickered, displaying images I hadn't taken, shots of the empty mansion from impossible angles, as if the camera were moving through the halls on its own, documenting every shadow, every corner where the spirits might hide. I tried to turn the camera off, but the power button wouldn't respond. The device seemed to have developed a will of its own, the lens adjusting focus with tiny mechanical whispers, the flash charging with an electronic whine that grew louder and more insistent. The spirits pressed closer, their forms gaining substance with each passing moment. I could see individual details now, the texture of their period clothing, the lines etched by suffering on their faces, the way their eyes reflected the camera's glow like those of nocturnal animals. Thomas stepped forward, his mouth moving in silent words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to tell me something about the ritual, about the way out, but his voice existed in a frequency my ears couldn't access. Only the camera could bridge that gap, could translate his spectral communication into something comprehensible. Against every rational thought, I raised the camera again. This time, when I looked through the viewfinder, I could see not just the spirits, but the traces of Blackwood's laboratory, equipment that had been removed decades ago, phantom tables and instruments overlaying the study's current arrangement like a double exposure. I pressed the shutter. The flash erupted with blinding intensity, far brighter than any I'd ever seen. In that moment of illumination, I saw everything. The complete ritual circle drawn in substances that had long since been cleaned away, the positioning of cameras and plates that no longer existed, and Thomas at the center of it all, finally able to speak. "Break the cameras," his voice echoed in my mind, clear as if he'd spoken directly into my ear. "All of them, before dawn, or we all become permanent." The flash faded, leaving me blinking in the darkness. When my vision cleared, the spirits were gone, but I knew they weren't far. They were inside the camera now, waiting, contained but not released. The LCD screen showed the last image I'd taken, but the figures in it were moving, pacing back and forth within the frame's confines like caged animals. I looked at my watch. 11:47 p.m. Dawn was still hours away, but I could feel time pressing against me like a physical weight. The camera was growing warmer in my hands, its electronic components humming with energy that shouldn't have been possible. Standing in that dark study, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of a man whose experiments had torn holes in reality itself, I faced a choice that would define not just my night, but possibly my existence. The spirits had shown me the way out, but following their advice meant destroying equipment worth thousands of dollars, abandoning a contract that could make or break my career. More importantly, it meant trusting the word of something that might not even be real. As I wrestled with the decision, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The camera's memory card counter was increasing on its own, showing new images being captured, even though I wasn't pressing the shutter. The spirits weren't just contained in my previous photos. They were actively using the camera now, documenting the world from their perspective, adding their own images to my memory cards. I scrolled through the new pictures with growing horror. They showed the mansion from impossible angles, shots taken from inside walls, from beneath floorboards, from perspectives that no living photographer could achieve. In several images, I could see myself working earlier in the day, unaware of the figures standing just behind me, their hands almost touching my shoulders. The final image in the sequence showed my face from just inches away, as if the camera had been held directly in front of me while I slept. But I hadn't been sleeping, and I certainly hadn't taken that photograph. That's when I realized the truth that Dr. Blackwood had discovered too late. The spirits weren't trapped in the photographs. They were the photographers now, using any camera in their presence to document their expanding reality, to pull more of themselves into the visible world with each captured image. And I was no longer the one in control of the camera. The LCD screen flickered again, displaying a message in text that appeared letter by letter, as if typed by invisible hands. "Thank you for the invitation. We have been so lonely." Outside, the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon. I had perhaps an hour before sunrise, before whatever process Blackwood had started reached its completion. The camera was no longer warm. It was burning hot, its plastic casing beginning to soften under my fingers. I made my choice. But as I raised the camera above my head, preparing to smash it against the study's stone floor, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window. Standing behind me, clearer than they'd ever been, were dozens of figures in period dress. and they were all smiling. The camera slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor without breaking. As I bent to retrieve it, I noticed something that made my heart stop completely. My reflection in the window was beginning to flicker, becoming translucent around the edges, taking on the same ethereal quality as the spirits that surrounded me. I looked down at my hands and watched them fade slightly, then solidify, then fade again, as if my very existence was becoming negotiable. The camera lay at my feet, its LCD screen now showing a live feed of the room from an angle that suggested it was floating several feet above the floor. In the image, I could see myself standing among the spirits, but I was no longer distinguishable from them. We were all the same gray, all the same desperate hunger made visible. I reached for the camera one last time, but my fingers passed through it like smoke. Dawn was breaking through the windows, painting the study in shades of gold and amber, but I could no longer feel the warmth of the light, could no longer hear the sounds of the waking world outside. I existed now only in the space between moments, in the pause between the shutters click and the flashes fade. The Blackwood estate still stands, and they still conduct tours for potential buyers. I know because I've seen the photographers who come to document it, watch them work through viewfinders they'll never understand, are no longer entirely their own. They always notice the gray figures in their photographs. They always find the journals. They always think they're the first to discover Dr. Blackwood's terrible legacy. But they're not alone behind their cameras. We're there with them, learning their techniques, borrowing their equipment, adding our own images to their memory cards. Each new photographer brings fresh technology, new possibilities for documentation, new ways to expand our collection. The auction listing for the Blackwood estate has been updated again. They're looking for another photographer, someone to capture the property's unique character and historical significance. I hope whoever takes the job understands that some things, once captured, prefer to stay that way. And I hope they remember to break their camera before dawn, though I suspect, like all the others, they won't. Story 2. The first thing you notice about true silence is how it amplifies everything else. I discovered this 3 weeks after purchasing the chest at the Henderson farm auction, when the familiar rhythm of my workshop, the whisper of sandpaper against wood, the soft tick of the wall clock, even the distant hum of the refrigerator, had become as natural as breathing. But when I stopped working, when I set down my tools and let the silence settle like dust over everything, that's when the chest began to sing. Not sing exactly, more like a low thrumming, barely perceptible, as if the wood itself was vibrating at a frequency just below human hearing. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before your ears catch it. I'd been restoring furniture for 15 years, specializing in pieces with history, the kind that families reluctantly part with when estates are settled or mortgages go unpaid. The Henderson auction had been typical in its melancholy. A century-old farmhouse emptied of its memories, everything from hand-carved wardrobes to chipped china laid out under the harsh October sun for strangers to appraise and bid upon. The chest had caught my eye immediately. Heavy oak construction, probably mid-1800s, with brass corner guards tarnished black and a patina that spoke of decades spent in humid basements or neglected attics. The lock was broken, hanging open like a slack jaw, and the interior reeked of mildew and something else, something metallic and stale that reminded me uncomfortably of old blood. But it was the craftsmanship that sold me. Dovetail joints so precise they seemed to flow into one another, and a lid that, despite its age, still fitted with the kind of tolerance that spoke of a master carpenter. I bid $75 and felt like I'd stolen it. The first week of restoration had been routine. I'd stripped away layers of grime and neglect, revealing wood grain so beautiful it made my chest ache. The brass had polished to a warm gold, and the broken lock, a simple tumbler mechanism, was an easy fix with parts from my supplier in Philadelphia. It was while sanding the lid that I found them. Symbols, not carved exactly, but pressed deep into the wood as if burned there with a brand. They followed the grain in flowing lines that reminded me of Arabic script, though I couldn't be certain. Some resembled nautical charts I'd seen in maritime museums, compass roses and directional markers, while others defied any classification I could imagine. At first they were barely visible, shadows in the wood that only appeared under direct light at certain angles. But as I worked, removing layers of old stain and wax, they became more pronounced, more insistent. That's when the humming started. Initially, I assumed it was the old pipes in the basement workshop where I'd set up my equipment. The building had been constructed in the 1920s, and the heating system groaned and whispered constantly. But this sound was different, organic somehow, with an irregular rhythm that reminded me of breathing. I found myself working later into the evenings, partly because the symbols seemed clearer under artificial light, but mostly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the chest wanted my attention. Which was ridiculous, of course. Furniture doesn't want anything, but alone in the workshop, with only the work light creating a small circle of warmth against the darkness, I began to understand why people believed in haunted objects. The chest dominated the space now, positioned on my main workbench like an altar. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that made my eyes water when I tried to focus. And the humming was getting louder. By the third week, I'd stopped pretending it was the pipes. The sound came specifically from the chest, rising and falling with an almost musical quality that made my skin crawl. More disturbing was my growing certainty that the sound was trying to communicate something, not through words, but through tone and rhythm, like a language of pure emotion. It was pulling me somewhere. The realization came gradually, the way fever builds in your body until you suddenly notice you're burning up. Every time the humming started, always during those moments of perfect silence, my attention was drawn inexorably toward the floor. Not just toward it, but through it, as if there was something below the concrete foundation that demanded acknowledgement. The basement. I'd been down there exactly once, when I'd first rented the space 6 years ago. It was unfinished, bare stone walls weeping moisture, a dirt floor, and a pervasive smell of decay that made breathing unpleasant. I'd stored some surplus lumber down there initially, but the dampness had warped it beyond use, and I'd eventually moved everything upstairs. Now, standing in my workshop with the chest humming its ancient song, I found myself remembering details I'd forgotten. The way the basement seemed to extend further than the building's footprint should have allowed. The feeling of being watched from the darker corners where my flashlight beam couldn't penetrate. The sound my footsteps had made on the packed earth, not echoing, but absorbed, as if the ground itself was listening. I tried working with headphones after that, but the humming seemed to resonate through my skull regardless of volume. Classical music, rock, even white noise, nothing could mask the chest's persistent call. That's when I heard the first voice. It happened on a Thursday evening, late enough that the street outside had gone quiet. I'd been applying the final coat of protective wax to the restored brass when the humming suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. Then, from somewhere below, a man spoke. I couldn't understand the words. They were in a language I didn't recognize, with rolling consonants and a cadence that suggested pleading. But the emotion was unmistakable, desperate, urgent need. I found myself moving toward the basement door without conscious decision, my hand already reaching for the light switch before rational thought reasserted itself. I stopped, heart hammering against my ribs, and forced myself to remain in the workshop. The voice came again, joined by others, a chorus of male voices speaking in what sounded like different languages. Spanish, maybe, something that might have been Portuguese, and others I couldn't identify. All with the same pleading tone, all seeming to come from directly beneath my feet, all saying what sounded like the same word, over and over. Voltar. I knew enough Spanish to recognize it meant return or come back. That night I researched the chest's history with an obsession that would have embarrassed me under normal circumstances. The Henderson family records were sparse, but I eventually traced the piece to a Captain Josiah Middleton, who'd owned it during the 1840s. Middleton had commanded merchant vessels operating out of Charleston and Savannah, though the specific nature of his trade wasn't documented in any records I could find. It wasn't until I expanded my search to ship manifests and port records that the picture became clear. Middleton had been a slaver. The chest had belonged to a man who'd spent 20 years transporting human cargo from West Africa to the plantations of the American South. And according to a memoir I found in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, Middleton had experienced what his contemporaries called a crisis of conscience in his final years. The memoir, written by a Charleston minister who'd counseled Middleton before his death, described the captain's obsession with performing some kind of ritual that would release the souls of the innocent from their earthly bonds. Middleton had apparently believed that the spirits of everyone who died during his voyages, hundreds of men, women, and children, were trapped in a state of limbo, unable to find peace until they were properly acknowledged and sent home. The minister had dismissed this as the ravings of a man driven mad by guilt, but the memoir included detailed descriptions of ceremonies Middleton had attempted, using his personal chest as a focal point. The captain believed the chest could serve as a portal, a way for the trapped souls to finally return to their ancestral lands. The rituals had never worked. Middleton died in 1854, still believing he'd failed in his duty to the dead. Reading this, alone in my workshop at 3 a.m. with the chest humming its ceaseless song, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The voices from the basement had grown more frequent over the past few days, and I'd begun to distinguish individual speakers. Always men, always pleading in languages I couldn't understand, always asking to return, always asking me to help them, because that's what they were doing, I realized. They weren't just speaking, they were speaking to me. The way their voices rose when I approached the basement door, the way the humming intensified when I worked on the chest, the way the symbols seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was all directed at me, personally. They wanted me to finish what Middleton had started. The next few days blurred together in a haze of insomnia and growing paranoia. I couldn't leave the workshop. The voices became agitated when I went upstairs, rising to an almost desperate wail that seemed to follow me wherever I went in the building. But staying meant enduring their constant presence, their relentless pleading, their absolute certainty that I was the one who could help them. I stopped eating regularly, stopped showering, stopped returning phone calls from clients wondering about their own restoration projects. The outside world felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the urgent need radiating from the basement. The chest had become the center of everything. I found myself arranging the workshop around it, moving tools and supplies to create a clear circle around the workbench where it sat. The symbols on the lid were fully visible now, seeming to glow with their own internal light that had nothing to do with the fluorescent bulbs overhead, and I was beginning to understand them. Not intellectually, I still couldn't read them like text, but their meaning was becoming clear in the same way you might understand the emotional content of music without knowing the specific notes being played. They were instructions, a map, a recipe for opening a doorway between this world and whatever lay beyond. The voices were getting stronger too. What had started as whispers from the basement now filled the entire workshop. Dozens of different men speaking in overlapping languages that somehow formed a coherent harmony. They spoke of home, verdant coastlines and red earth, families left behind, children who would never know their fathers' faces. They spoke of the deep water and the weight of chains, and the endless darkness of cargo holds, where men had become numbers on a shipping manifest. And they spoke of their hope that finally, someone would finish the ritual that would let them go home. On the 7th night, I went down to the basement. Not because I'd made a conscious decision, but because the voices had become so insistent that I found myself descending the narrow stairs without memory of how I'd gotten there. The flashlight in my hand illuminated a space that seemed larger than I remembered, stretching back into shadows that swallowed the beam long before it should have reached the far wall. The voices were louder here, coming from the packed earth floor as if dozens of men were buried just beneath my feet. I could hear them clearly now. Individual words, phrases, entire sentences in languages that my conscious mind didn't recognize, but that some deeper part of me understood perfectly. They were giving me instructions. The chest, they explained, needed to be brought down here, to this liminal space between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The symbols needed to be activated, not by reading them, but by pressing my hands against them while speaking the words they were teaching me, words in languages I'd never learned but somehow knew, words that would open the door they'd been waiting over a century to walk through. I climbed back upstairs and stared at the chest, my hands shaking with exhaustion and something that might have been anticipation. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about psychotic breaks and carbon monoxide poisoning and the dangers of sleep deprivation. But that voice seemed thin and distant compared to the urgent need emanating from below. The men in the basement weren't asking for much, just acknowledgement. Just the chance to go home after more than a century of waiting. Just someone to finish what Captain Middleton had started and failed to complete. Just someone to care enough about their suffering to act. I picked up the chest. It was heavier than it should have been, as if it contained more than just empty space and old wood. The symbols under my hands seemed to pulse with warmth, and the humming that had started this entire ordeal now filled my head with such intensity that I could barely think. But I could feel them. Dozens of souls pressing close, guiding my movements, whispering encouragement as I carried their only hope toward the basement stairs. The door stood open below me, leading down into darkness that no longer seemed threatening but welcoming. Expectant. Home. I took the first step down, then the second, the voices rising around me in what might have been celebration, or might have been my own mind finally surrendering to the isolation and stress of the past month. The chest grew heavier with each step, or perhaps I was growing weaker. But it didn't matter. Almost there. Almost home. Almost finished. The basement floor felt soft beneath my feet, like sand on a distant shore. I set the chest down carefully, reverently, and placed my hands on the symbols carved into its lid. They were warm now, almost hot, and I could feel them moving under my palms like living things. The words came without thought, spilling from my lips in languages I'd never spoken but had always known. The air around me began to thicken, taking on weight and substance until it felt like I was breathing water. And in that thickness, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the shadows at the edge of my vision, waiting. Men of every age, wearing the remnants of clothing from a dozen different cultures, all watching me with expressions of desperate hope. Behind them, others, women and children, families torn apart by the institution that had brought them to this place and trapped them here. They reached toward me with hands that cast no shadows, spoke to me with voices that made no sound, pleaded with me to complete the ritual that would set them free. I pressed harder against the symbols, spoke the words faster, felt the chest begin to vibrate beneath my hands as something fundamental about the space around me began to change. The boundary between here and there was thinning, becoming permeable, allowing passage for souls that had been denied rest for far too long. The chest opened. Not physically. The lid remained closed beneath my hands. But something inside it opened, creating a passage that I felt rather than saw. A doorway back to the lands these people had been stolen from, back to the families that had mourned them, back to the peace they'd been denied for over a century. One by one they stepped forward and disappeared, not into the chest, but through it, using it as a bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond. I felt each passage like a weight lifting from my shoulders, a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying finally being set down. The last to go was a young man, barely out of his teens, who paused to look directly at me before following the others. His mouth moved in what might have been a word of thanks, or farewell, or blessing. Then they were gone, and I was alone in the basement with an empty chest and the gradually fading echo of voices that had finally found their way home. I climbed back upstairs as dawn broke through the workshop windows, carrying the chest that now felt as light as it looked. The symbols on its lid had faded back to barely visible impressions in the wood, and the humming that had dominated my world for the past month was finally, blessedly silent. But as I set the chest back on my workbench and looked around the workshop that I could barely remember leaving, I found myself wondering about the rational explanations I'd dismissed so easily. about carbon monoxide and psychotic breaks and the very real possibility that I'd spent the last several hours talking to myself in an empty basement, performing a ritual for people who existed only in my own exhausted mind. The chest looked ordinary now, just a piece of restored furniture waiting for its new owner. No longer singing, no longer demanding attention, no longer pulling my awareness toward depths I couldn't fathom. But when I ran my fingers over the symbols on its lid, I could still feel the faintest warmth beneath the wood. And when the workshop fell completely silent, when the ambient noise of the city faded and the building settled into perfect stillness, I thought I could hear something that might have been wind, or waves, or the distant sound of voices singing songs of homecoming in languages I'd never learned but would always remember. The phone rang, jarring me back to the present. A client, wondering about the progress on an antique desk I'd forgotten I was supposed to be working on. I told her it would be ready by the end of the week and hung up to get back to work. Normal work. Rational work. The kind that didn't require questioning whether the voices in your basement were real or just the sound of your own mind finding ways to cope with stories too terrible to process. But as I reached for my sanding block, I noticed something that made my hand freeze halfway to the tool rack. Footprints in the sawdust on the basement door threshold. Barefoot impressions that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, leading from the stairs to where I'd been standing. Footprints that weren't mine. I stared at them for a long moment, then deliberately swept the sawdust clean and went back to work, humming softly to myself to fill the silence. Story 3. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric requiem above me as I settled into another graveyard shift at Westfield Commons, though calling it that felt like a cruel joke. The mall had been gutted 18 months ago, stripped of everything that once made it alive. Now I patrolled empty storefronts and hollow corridors, watching over nothing more than dust and memories that belonged to other people. My name is Marcus, and I've been the night security guard here for 6 weeks. The job pays well enough to keep me from asking too many questions about why anyone would need security for a place that held nothing worth stealing. The management company's instructions were simple: patrol every 2 hours, monitor the camera feeds, and report anything unusual. What they didn't mention was how the silence could crawl under your skin like a living thing. The security office sat in what used to be the mall's administrative center, a cramped room lined with monitors displaying feeds from cameras scattered throughout the building. Most showed the same thing night after night: empty corridors bathed in the sickly glow of emergency lighting, vacant storefronts with their metal gates pulled down like closed eyelids. The images flickered occasionally, probably from outdated equipment, but nothing that seemed worth mentioning in my reports. That changed on a Tuesday night in October. I was nursing my third cup of coffee when movement on monitor 7 caught my eye. The screen showed Corridor 9B, a service hallway that ran behind what used to be the food court. A figure moved across the frame, tall, wearing what looked like a hooded jacket or coat that obscured any identifying features. The person walked with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. My radio crackled to life as I reached for it. The dispatcher's voice seemed unusually distant when I reported the possible intruder. She told me to investigate but advised caution, reminding me that the building had multiple entry points that weren't always secure. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, leaving the monitors behind. Corridor 9B lay in the mall's northeastern section, accessible through a maintenance door behind the defunct Sparrow. The journey there took me through the main concourse, past shops that had been stripped bare, but still bore the ghostly outlines of their former signage. My footsteps echoed in the vast space, creating a rhythm that seemed to follow me rather than originate from my movement. When I reached the corridor, it was empty. I swept my flashlight beam across the narrow space, illuminating water-stained walls and a concrete floor marked by years of foot traffic. The air carried a musty smell, like old books mixed with something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. Nothing suggested anyone had been there recently. I was about to head back when I noticed something odd about the wall at the corridor's far end. What I had initially taken for a shadow appeared to be an alcove or doorway, though my flashlight couldn't penetrate its depths. I approached slowly, my shoes scuffing against the concrete with sounds that seemed too loud in the confined space. The alcove was deeper than it appeared, extending back into darkness that my light couldn't fully reach. More troubling was the feeling that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The building's blueprints, which I'd studied during my orientation, showed Corridor 9B ending at a solid wall. Yet here was clear evidence of space beyond that supposed barrier. I radioed in my findings, describing the discrepancy between the blueprints and what I was seeing. The dispatcher's response came after a longer pause than usual, her voice carrying an odd quality that I couldn't quite place. She suggested I had probably discovered an old utility access that wasn't included in the current building plans, nothing unusual for a structure that had been renovated multiple times over the years. Her explanation made sense, but it didn't address the growing unease I felt standing there. The darkness ahead seemed different from the ordinary absence of light, thicker somehow, as if it had substance. I decided to return to the security office rather than explore further. Back among the monitors, I immediately checked the feed from Corridor 9B. The screen showed the same empty hallway I had just left, but something felt wrong about the image. The perspective seemed slightly off, as if the camera had been moved a few degrees since my last viewing. I made a note to check the camera mountings during my next patrol. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but I found myself returning repeatedly to Monitor 7, watching for any sign of movement. The corridor remained static and empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, that the camera was somehow failing to capture what was really there. The next night brought a repeat performance. The same figure appeared on the monitor at almost exactly the same time, moving through Corridor 9B with that same purposeful stride. This time, I was ready, having positioned myself closer to the corridor before the appointed hour. I reached the scene within minutes of spotting the movement, but again found nothing except empty space and that troubling alcove that shouldn't exist. The pattern continued for the next several nights. The hooded figure would appear on the monitor. I would rush to investigate and I would find nothing. Each time, the image quality seemed to degrade slightly, as if the camera was aging in fast forward. Static began creeping into the feed, creating momentary distortions that made it difficult to discern details about the mysterious person. It was during my second week of these nightly encounters that the radio transmissions began. I had just returned from another fruitless chase when my radio erupted with voices that definitely weren't coming from our dispatch center. The signal was weak and shot through with static, but I could make out fragments of what sounded like emergency broadcasts. The voices carried the formal, clipped tones of professional radio announcers, though they used terminology and speaking patterns that seemed oddly dated. The clearest transmission I managed to record came through during my third week. Reports continued to come in regarding the mass disappearances at the Westfield Commons location. Officials are asking residents to avoid the area while emergency services conduct their search operations. The missing persons were last seen entering the building's lower levels, which appear to have been part of the original civil defense structure. The broadcast cut off abruptly, leaving only the normal static of an empty channel. I played back the recording several times, trying to parse its meaning. The reporter had mentioned Westfield Commons specifically, but referred to it as if the mall was still operational. More puzzling was the reference to missing persons and lower levels that didn't appear on any of the building plans I had access to. I decided to research the building's history during my off hours. What I discovered in the city planning office's archives explained much while raising even more disturbing questions. Westfield Commons had indeed been built on the foundation of a Cold War-era fallout shelter, constructed in the late 1950s and abandoned when the civil defense program was scaled back in the 1970s. The mall's construction in the early 1980s had incorporated some of the existing underground infrastructure, though the exact details were obscured by decades of bureaucratic record-keeping. More troubling were the newspaper clippings I found from 1973. A series of articles described a string of disappearances centered around the abandoned shelter site. 17 people had vanished over a period of 3 months, all last seen in the vicinity of what would eventually become the mall. The investigation had gone nowhere, with police reports describing the shelter as thoroughly searched and structurally sound. The disappearances stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind only questions and grieving families. Armed with this new knowledge, I approached my next shift with a mixture of dread and determination. The hooded figure appeared right on schedule, moving through Corridor 9B with what now seemed like familiar routine. But instead of immediately rushing to intercept them, I decided to observe more carefully, studying the monitor for details I might have missed. The figure moved differently than I had initially thought. Rather than walking through the corridor, they seemed to be guiding something or someone else, gesturing toward areas off camera with movements that suggested communication or instruction. Most unsettling was the realization that their path didn't follow the corridor's actual layout. They moved as if navigating a space larger and more complex than what I knew existed. This time, when I went to investigate, I brought additional equipment: a second flashlight, my smartphone with its camera and voice recorder activated, and a crude map I had sketched of the area. I also made sure to announce my movements over the radio, creating an audio record of my activities. Corridor 9B was empty as always, but the mysterious alcove seemed different. The darkness beyond appeared less absolute, and I thought I could detect the faintest suggestion of air movement, as if there were open space ahead. I approached the threshold slowly, my flashlight beam probing the shadows. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the building's layout. The alcove opened onto a much larger space, a room or corridor that extended well beyond the range of my light. The walls appeared to be constructed from older materials, rough concrete and exposed rebar that looked nothing like the mall's modern construction. The air carried a different smell too, earthier and more humid, with undertones that reminded me of old basements and forgotten places. I was about to step through the threshold when my radio erupted with another transmission, this one clearer than any previous broadcast. All personnel are advised that the lower evacuation routes remain active. Citizens reporting to the shelter should proceed directly to Assembly Point Charlie via the northeastern access tunnel. Do not attempt to use the main entrances, which have been compromised. Emergency services are standing by to assist with the relocation process. The voice had the authoritative tone of an official emergency broadcast, but its content made no sense in the context of an abandoned shopping mall. More disturbing was the timestamp that appeared on my radio's display. The transmission was supposedly being received from a frequency that hadn't been in use since the early 1970s. I backed away from the alcove, my unease now approaching outright fear. The space beyond that threshold felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, as if it existed in violation of basic principles of architecture and physics. Yet the radio transmission suggested that someone or something was treating it as an active emergency facility, directing people to locations that shouldn't exist. Over the following nights, the pattern intensified. The hooded figure appeared more frequently, sometimes multiple times per shift. The radio transmissions became more detailed and urgent, describing evacuation procedures and emergency protocols for a facility that had been abandoned for decades. Most troubling of all, I began to notice that the transmissions seemed to be responding to my presence, as if some invisible authority was aware of my investigations. The breaking point came during my 4th week on the job. I had just completed my routine patrol when every monitor in the security office simultaneously displayed the same image: Corridor 9B, but not as I knew it. The camera showed a bustling scene of people moving through the space with obvious urgency. They wore clothing from an earlier era, heavy coats and formal wear that looked distinctly 1970s in style. All of them moved toward the mysterious alcove, which appeared in the camera feed as a brightly lit tunnel entrance. But when I rushed to the actual corridor, I found it empty as always. The discrepancy between what the cameras showed and what my eyes could see had become absolute. I was witnessing two different realities occupying the same physical space, and I had no way to determine which one was real. The revelation that finally shattered my confidence came when I discovered something I had somehow missed during all my previous visits to Corridor 9B. Carved into the wall beside the alcove, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, were dozens of names and dates. All of the dates fell within that 3-month period in 1973, when the disappearances had occurred. All of the names matched those listed in the newspaper articles I had researched. But at the bottom of the list, carved in fresher-looking letters, was my own name followed by today's date. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands began to shake. The radio crackled to life one final time, the transmission clearer than ever. Security personnel Marcus Reynolds, please report to Assembly Point Charlie for immediate evacuation. The shelter protocols are now in full effect. Please proceed to the northeastern access tunnel without delay. I ran. I ran through empty corridors and past vacant storefronts, my footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces like gunshots. Behind me, I could hear other footsteps keeping pace, though when I looked back I saw nothing but darkness. The security office felt like sanctuary when I finally reached it, though even there the monitors showed things that couldn't be real. Crowds of people moving through corridors I knew to be empty, emergency lights flashing in spaces that had no power, the hooded figure standing in the doorway of the office itself, gesturing for me to follow. I've been sitting here for hours now, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. The radio continues its impossible broadcasts, describing an evacuation that ended 40 years ago, but somehow continues in the present. The monitors show a building full of people who aren't there, or perhaps I'm the one who isn't there, watching from some space between what was and what is. The thing that terrifies me most is not the supernatural impossibility of what I'm experiencing, but the growing certainty that it all makes perfect sense. The hooded figure isn't a ghost or hallucination. It's a guide, doing exactly what it was trained to do in 1973, when the shelter's emergency protocols were activated for reasons that were never recorded in any official documents. It's still doing its job, leading people to safety in a facility that was never officially closed because the emergency never officially ended. The question that haunts me as I write this report is simple. Am I witnessing the past bleeding through into the present, or have I somehow slipped backward into an event that never fully concluded? The people who disappeared in 1973, were they evacuated to safety in a shelter that exists outside normal time and space? Or are they still there, waiting in assembly points that exist in the margins between what is real and what is necessary? I don't know if anyone will read this report. I don't know if my radio calls are reaching a dispatcher in the present day or being recorded by emergency services that were disbanded decades ago. What I do know is that the hooded figure is standing behind me now, visible in the reflection on my monitor screen even though the camera shows an empty office. It's holding out its hand in a gesture that is unmistakably an invitation. The radio is speaking my name again, directing me to Assembly Point Charlie. The northeastern access tunnel is waiting. The emergency protocols are in full effect, and I am the only one left who hasn't reported for evacuation. Maybe it's time I stopped running from whatever this is and accepted that some emergencies don't end just because the calendar pages turn. Maybe the only way out of this nightmare is to follow the guide who has been trying to help me all along, to trust in procedures that were designed to save lives even when those lives exist in times and places that shouldn't be possible. I can hear them now, all of them. The voices of people who found their way to safety in a shelter that exists everywhere and nowhere, in a time that was and is and always will be 1973. They're calling my name, welcoming me home to a place I've never been, but somehow always known was waiting. The hooded figure is patient. It has been patient for 50 years. It will wait as long as necessary for me to understand that the evacuation isn't over, that it can never be over, that somewhere beneath the abandoned shopping mall, and the empty corridors, and the broken dreams of American commerce, the shelter protocols remain in effect, and the people who followed them remain safe. All I have to do is follow the guide. All I have to do is step through the threshold. All I have to do is report to Assembly Point Charlie and join the evacuation that never ends, because the emergency that started it never truly began. The monitors are showing me the way. The radio is calling my name. The hooded figure is waiting. It's time to go home. Story 4. The cold had teeth that night. I'd been driving the same route through Santa Catarina's highlands for 12 years, hauling freight between Sao Paulo and Porto Alegre. But I'd never felt winter bite like this. The thermometer on my dashboard read -8 Celsius, and the wind outside howled with the voice of something hungry. My breath fogged the cabin despite the heater running full blast, and frost crept along the edges of my windshield like searching fingers. The smart thing would have been to push through to the next truck stop, but exhaustion weighed heavier than common sense. My eyes burned from staring at the endless ribbon of asphalt, and the caffeine pills I'd swallowed hours ago had worn off, leaving me jittery and hollow. When I spotted the familiar pull-off area, a small gravel lot carved into the mountainside where drivers sometimes caught a few hours of sleep, I knew I had to stop. I killed the engine, and silence crashed over me like a wave. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping world, but something deeper, more absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I tilted the seat back, pulled my jacket tighter, and closed my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. The cold seeped through the metal walls of my cab, and with it came something else, a presence that made the hair on my arms stand upright. When I opened my eyes an hour later, my windshield had transformed into a canvas of impossible art. Ice crystals covered the glass in intricate patterns that defied explanation. These weren't the random formations I'd seen countless times before, spiderwebs of frost spreading from the edges, or the delicate fern-like structures that bloomed overnight on winter windows. These symbols had purpose, intention. They formed lines and curves that mapped out roads, intersections, and landmarks with surgical precision. The frost had drawn me a route. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The patterns remained, clear as highway signs. The ice had traced a path that diverged from the main highway about 5 kilometers ahead, winding through side roads I'd never noticed before, leading to what looked like a dead end deep in the mountains. At the terminus of this frozen map, a circular symbol pulsed with an inner light that couldn't be explained by reflected moonbeams. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Condensation patterns, temperature differentials, the way streetlights might create optical illusions on frost-covered glass. But my gut knew better. This was something else entirely. I started the engine, and the heater's warm breath began erasing the edges of the ice map. Panic seized me as I watched hours of intricate work dissolving before my eyes. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and snapped photos, but the camera couldn't capture what I saw. The screen showed only ordinary frost patterns, meaningless and random. The smart thing would have been to drive away, get back on the highway, find the next truck stop, grab coffee and forget this ever happened. Instead, I put the truck in gear and headed for the main road, my eyes locked on the remaining portions of the ice route as they slowly melted away. 5 kilometers down the highway, exactly where the frost map indicated, I found the turnoff. A narrow paved road I'd somehow missed in 12 years of driving this route, marked by a sign so weathered I couldn't read it in the darkness. The pavement looked newer than it should have, as if it had been recently laid but artificially aged. I pulled over and consulted my GPS, but the device showed nothing. No road, no path, just empty mountain terrain where I could clearly see asphalt disappearing into the trees. That should have been my second warning to turn around. I steered onto the side road anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating pine trees